Thank you. The reading that we took, you may have thought, was a bit of a complicated one. And even though we read only a short piece of Romans chapter 2, it didn't necessarily get less complicated because it was short. In fact, in some ways, it might have been less complicated if we'd read the whole chapter. But it doesn't matter that it's complicated because we're not going to talk about the complicated things that are there today. We do want to begin with Romans chapter 2, or in a minute we want to begin with it, and we do want to end with it, but we only want to make a couple of simple points out of it, so I hope that'll work for you and you won't feel too frightened. Don't worry if you feel a little bit frightened, because I want to make a confession at this point, which is that I've always been a little bit frightened about history. I always found history a horrible thing because there's such a lot of it. Tonight we just want to look at the history that's in the Old Testament, not the history that's in the New Testament or any other history. But even if we just take the history that's in the Old Testament, it's still a bit complicated, and in some ways it's a bit frightening. So things like who came first? Abraham or Moses? Who came first, Jesus or David? And sometimes we know the answers to those sort of questions, and other times we're not quite sure in history who comes before who. So I found that was a frighteningly complicated thing for a lot of my life. You can tell I'm not a historian, can't you? I'm an engineer, and I like to be able to see things easily. So one of the tricks that I used to help me with history is to put them down and to see who came first. So I've put on the screen some timelines and some number of years. So the first one, let's see if I can point to these for you. Let's try this one. Yeah, the grey one at the top there takes us from today, 2023, back to the time of Jesus, 2,000 years. That's where the Old Testament finishes, roughly. So if we go back another 4,000 years before Jesus, that's more or less where the Old Testament begins. At least conventionally, that's a way of measuring it out. And of course, 4,000 years is a frighteningly long time. If you know people who are old, then 4,000 years is much, much older than anybody you know. And back there is where much of the Old Testament happens. So on the picture here, we've got some things that we know about from history, like the creation, or the curse in the Garden of Eden, or the global flood, the story of Noah, the Tower of Babel, things that we've heard about, and maybe we're not very good at putting them in order, which came first. Or Egypt, how old is Egypt? Or Abraham, or the Ice Age. And as we move through, we come to the books of Judges. The beginning of the period of the Judges is often considered, as we put on this slide, to belong to the period of Moses. And then when that period of history comes to an end, we come into the period of the Kings. These are things that are part of the Old Testament history, but we can draw them out on a timeline like the one that I just showed you before, and that can make it easier for us. One of the interesting things, though, which relates to the reading that maybe you've still got open on your lap and I've still got open here, one of the interesting things is who is the Bible mostly about when it's dealing with its periods of history? And you can probably see who that section of Romans was talking about, even if you didn't follow all of what he was saying about it. So most of what happens in the Bible's history happens in about 1,000 years. Although on the screen here we've got 2,500, 3,000 years, all of this on the screen is before the interesting part of Bible history. When I say the interesting part, the part that the Bible seems to be most interested in comes after all of these 27 characters, which give us 2,500 years of history, and God quickly moves that introductory 2,500 years out of the Bible, and then comes to the big part of the Bible where most of the Bible's history settles in just 1,000 years. So we're going to be looking at why God does that with Old Testament history. Why God's epic is focused down on quite a short space of time. Not that 1,000 years is really short, but compared to all of the time that we know about. Another way that the Bible focuses down on a particular piece of history is that it focuses down, let's give you this slide, focuses down sociologically. That is to say, it's interested in the races, the people in the world, and it's interested in the places, the countries in the world. And what it does with those things as it goes through the history is it gets very interested in quite a small scope. So I'm bringing into your minds the word focus. God, as the historian of the world, through what he tells us of his written history in the Old Testament, is very much more focused than we would have imagined he was going to be. He doesn't try and tell us something about everything. God is quite happy, as a writer of history, to leave things out if he's not interested in them so much, and focuses in on the things that he is quite interested in. And it's quite interesting for us to see, when we're talking about the races of mankind, which particular race, which nation is God interested in? So, and there's the answer to this question, and this is why we started with Romans 2:17, which said, "And thou that art called a Jew." It's in fact, what we find, in fact, is that the Jewish nation, particularly in that 1,000 years, that 1,000 years at the end of the Old Testament that God focuses on, the Jewish nation takes centre stage. So I've written that down there for you. Ethnically, the message is carried by just one nation. Only a few other nations and empires are mentioned. A lot just aren't. So we know then the Jews are very much what world history is about. There are other nations, and we've heard of nations like Rome and Greece, Persia, Babylon, Assyria, Egypt. Very well-known nations in history, but not much they are there in the Bible, but there isn't a lot about them because they're not where God's focus in history is. And these other nations, so there's about a dozen nations where God tells us something about what they are doing, but very, very little, in fact, about what they're doing compared to what's happening with the Jewish nation. So ethnically, as far as the history of nations is concerned, the Bible is particularly choosy and focuses down on one thing. The other thing we said sociologically we can look at is geography. And what does the Bible do with geography? And it does the same sort of thing. It takes a particular area of land and seems to keep looking at that area all the time, and lots of other places it doesn't look at very much at all. Let's see if you recognise these. So here is the Jews at the top in their land, what we now call the land of Israel. And there are a few other places, but they don't feature half as much as the nation of Israel. So Syria, Lebanon, Phoenicia, Gaza, Palestine, Cyprus. We could add the rest in there, couldn't we? Other places that you've heard of, but you probably find it hard to find the verses in the Bible where these places come, because there aren't very many places in the Bible where these places come, but the nation of Israel keeps coming up again and again through the Bible's version of history. Now I've used the word version instead of the word focus. But of course, whenever you read a history book, it's written by somebody, and the name of the author on the history book is the name of the person who had a particular story to tell. And the story that he tells is what he thinks of history, what he thinks matters in history. Sometimes the title of the history will tell us what he's going to be interested in. The history of France, the history of nuclear fusion. What a particular thing the author is interested in will be where his focus is in his history. But the history of the world, as the Bible records it for us, and as is told for us through God's revealing of it, is all focused down very much in the things that matter to God. One of the things then that's interesting to us is to ask the question, well, what really wasn't God interested in then? What does God leave out if we're talking about geography, as we've just been doing? If we look at the world, and there's half of the world on the screen, same half on both screens, that's useful. That's the half that's not in the Bible. Half the world is not in Bible history. 2 continents of the continents of the world are not there, really. North America, South America, those continents that include Canada, the USA, Central American states, Mexico, the Caribbean countries, hard to find in the Bible. They're not really important in the way the Bible describes its history, not even in the section where God spends a lot of time, that middle 1,000 years. If we turn the world around and look at that's the same half. What did I press there? Look at the other half, then from the right-hand side, we've got the Pacific Rim, the countries where Japan, Indonesia, Korea, China, and those countries of what we call the East come from. These are places that are not really in the Bible. All of the Far East, Australasia, and as we come across the globe now, across the Indian Ocean, and India is in the middle there in purple, just not there in the Bible. All on the left of Africa, all of the sub-Saharan African countries anyway, those at the bottom there below the equator, not mentioned in the Bible. They're all left out. God is focusing, as we said, on a particular place where history, the important parts of history, the parts of history that are important to God, where they happen. Even Europe, that we might otherwise have thought was so important, is largely left out. So it's as though we're taking the magnifying glass and we're looking closely at certain things in history, and they just don't leave us any room to look at many other things. There's a focus. We said that the Bible passed over very quickly the 2,500 years at the beginning of time. Most of that is the book of Genesis. And 3/4 of the book of Genesis is based around a dynasty, the dynasty of Abraham, the nation of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. 3/4 of that book is interested in 3 or 4 characters, and the history of those people is the history that's important, to the exclusion of other things. And what we find is that that period of history, which is small in the Bible and introduces the period of history that is important in the Bible, that period of history keeps being referenced. So Abraham isn't only in Genesis. He comes back in Exodus. He comes back in the other books of the Bible. He even comes back in the New Testament, which we're not going to talk about today at all. But it's easy to find Abraham all through chapters like Galatians 3 and 4, chapters like Romans 4, chapters like Hebrews 7, sections of Peter's epistle and James's epistle. They're talking about Abraham as an important man. And in the history that God writes, he's right there at the beginning as an important man. In the things that God is focusing on in his history, the patriarchal period, period 1 of God's history, begins with founding fathers, men like Abraham and his son, grandson, and those who came from him. So it's like we need to look with a microscope, and that God does look with a microscope at the things that really matter. And what God is doing with these characters is what he does through history. He is telling us how we can classify things which are important and things which are not important. And so the nation of the Jews that we introduced in Romans chapter 2 there, the nation who came from Abraham, are important to God. And the other nations, and we listed some that were there in the Bible, and then we showed many that are not even there in the Bible. The other nations, there's a word for them in the Bible. So we've got a word Jews, and we've got a word Gentiles. And the word Gentile means all the rest. And the word Jews means the ones who God is interested in. That's how focused God is. And what he does with nations, we've seen he does with places, we've seen he does with time periods, he also does with individuals. So what he's asking us when we think about the history that he's revealed to us is he's asking us to think about ourselves. We're individual people. And he's asking us to classify ourselves in the way that he's classified time and space and races. He classifies individuals too. And the question for us is, are we the individuals who God is interested in? Are we the individuals who are related to the covenants of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? And even the world views that people have, how they understand the world, can be classified into those two kinds. The interesting kind, the kind of worldview that has room for faith, a faith-based worldview, and the kind of worldview that has no place for faith in it at all, the faithless worldview. And what is our worldview? That's what the Bible is suggesting to us, is a question we ought to ask, and a question that we ought to try and learn from Bible history. So that comes to us right at the beginning when God starts to open up history for us. And when we come into period 2, the period of Moses and Joshua, just two individuals, we see the same thing going through. We see that God has got a plan of salvation, and he's making that very clear. God's plan of salvation is focused in a place with a people at a time, and yet it's not a plan of salvation just for a few people. It is a plan of salvation for the world. And so we've said that this is world history. This is the epic of world history that God is giving us in the Bible. Even though it's got a focus, even though it is very narrow, yet it is God's story of how he plans to save the globe, the world, the whole of humanity. How can that work? What does God think? How is God going to save the world? God is my strong salvation. We sung together at the beginning. But how does that work? God will explain that for us. So in this second period, when we look at Moses and Joshua, we see that in just 5 books, right at the beginning of the Bible, there are 39 Old Testament books, but in just books 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, in just those 5 books that follow on from Genesis, in just the lifespans of just 2 people, Moses and Joshua, who probably only lived for 70 or 80 or 90 years altogether, small period of history, carry important lessons. So God's spending more chapters, more Bible books in working out the lessons for us from that period of history. And then we can move forward again and look at the rest of the Old Testament. So that's 39, take away 6. 33 more books that make up a big chunk of our Bibles, about that much compared to that, about that much. And then this is the New Testament. A big chunk of our Bibles, most of the rest of the Old Testament, is this 1,000 years, which God gets very excited about. This period when God brings a family out of the land of Egypt and then makes them into a nation called the nation of Israel. The people are the Jews, and God is going to make his plan of salvation for the world known by that small people living in that small country there in the Middle East at that small period of ancient history. About 400 years for the period of the judges, and then about 600 years for the period of the kings. So there's our 1,000 years that we said was what most of the Old Testament is about. Now we might think, well, we've got a problem now, because if we've got to do 1,000 years in the next 5 minutes, that could be tricky. But we managed okay with the 2,500 years, didn't we? Let's be brave. What's happening in history, which we often think, when we feel frightened about it, we often think nothing happens. It's all very hard. But what actually happens in history is it just whizzes. It moves. Things change. And God gives us his plan of salvation by making things happen, or recording things that were important when they happened, things that were important to him, things that are important to his message. That's a little bit difficult to read. This is at the beginning of this movement from Exodus through Joshua, Moses, Joshua, the judges. This period at the beginning is a period of movement where people who lived in the nation of Israel lived as a collection of tribes. You probably know there were 12 tribes of Israel. And those tribes were welded together by something. It wasn't cement and it wasn't glue, but there was something connected with the covenants that God had made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And they are moving forward, so these people who are now becoming a great nation have a unique structure as a nation. They're different from the other nations because they all know that they all descended from the same person. People in Britain don't know who they've descended from. Some of us know that we've got Welsh blood in us. Some of us might know that we've got Scottish blood in us. And some of us might know that we're related to people from European or other nations somewhere back in our history. But for the Jews, they all knew that they had come from Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. They could trace that through. It was a dynastic structure. There was an invisible bond. And they weren't happy. So the story of the kings begins with Samuel, where everybody says, we want a king. We want a king like the other nations. We want a king to fight our battles. And God surprises Samuel by saying, okay. And this is a momentous thing, particularly when we look at the movement of history, because by God saying, yes, they can have a king, he is going to change the balance. He's going to change the nature of this people who are at the very centre of history. Things will never be the same. What God keeps up his sleeve for a while, it seems, is that when he said, yes, you can have a king, he didn't mean, yes, you can have a king like the other nations. So the kings of Israel were never kings like the other nations had, just in the same way that the tribal nation of Israel had not been a nation like any other nation. So the nation of the Jews is always different. And the monarchy of the Jews, the kingdoms of men like David, Hezekiah, they were monarchies where the king was like a shepherd. And David was the psalmist who gave us, the Lord is my shepherd. They ruled as kings who cared for their people. They were a shepherd-based monarchy. So there's a great contrast there, series of contrasts on the slide here, between the old covenant that had gone before and the new covenant. The covenant of the king was different from the covenant of the ancestors, Abraham, Moses, and those. He was a sovereign state now. He was a state that had a capital city. He was a state that even had the prototype of the temple that was central to God's plan of salvation, which is a little bit outside our story today. So let's pass on from that. The old covenant was given on Mount Sinai. It was invested in Aaron. Not so the new covenant of David. That was given on Mount Zion, Jerusalem. That was the kingly covenant. These things are different and important, and they're marked there in the Old Testament. We're not turning them up. We're staying with Romans chapter 2. But those are things that we can see developing as the 1,000 years goes on. And much of that's outside our scope. We're just focusing on the way God has focused through history. The final stage of the Old Testament history is the movement into the prophets. And again, if we just looked for our prophets in our Bible, quite a large section of our Old Testaments belongs to the prophets. The prophets tell the closing stage of Old Testament history, where things are going wrong. Let's be brutally honest about it. And perhaps that's the most interesting part of history in a way. We like to see things going wrong sometimes, providing it's not to us. And things certainly went wrong in the Old Testament. And it's interesting to look at, and we're not doing this tonight, this is another subject, the Bible, what the Bible says about prophecy, just as it's interesting if you're interested in poetry, to look at what the Bible does with poetry. But those are other subjects. But certainly history moves into a period of prophets. Early on, prophets like Elijah, the great prophet, but always the message of the prophet is that the people are losing the picture of world's history, losing the picture of God's plan of salvation, and even ready to break the covenants by which God has constituted them, the covenants that are essential and central to God's plan of history. So that's sad, isn't it? It's sad that the Old Testament has got to come to a conclusion with a broken covenant and with a broken people in a broken place. But that is how it works. But of course, the prophets are there to say that's not the end of history. And the prophets are there to say, yes, but there will be a remnant of individual people in this nation who will yet believe and who will continue in their connection with God's plan of salvation. Romans 11 on the screen here says, so too, at the present time, there is a remnant chosen by grace. And that's the message of the prophets. The suffering servant features there in the prophet at the conclusion of Old Testament history. He is the Lord Jesus Christ. He's there in the Old Testament history, but he belongs with the New Testament and with Romans chapter 3 and chapter 2. So that's where we'll finish. We said we'd come back to Romans chapter 2, and Romans chapter 2 is talking about these things that we've talked about, how the Jews were God's special people, and yet it isn't just that you're called a Jew. It isn't just that you call yourself a Jew. It isn't just that you're proud of being a Jew. It's that you're related to God's promises. It's that you're related to God's history. It's that you're making the right choices in your belief. It's that you are contributing to the movement of history in your life in a right direction, that you are taking it forward, that you are taking it somewhere, and that you are ready to belong with the Lord Jesus Christ, to whom all of Old Testament prophecy points, and in which the hope of the remnant that the prophets spoke of rests. Thank you.